you, Darren. And thank you to Howard and to Dr. Carson for inviting me over here. And thank you to you guys for mostly finishing your lunch before I start talking. So this was supposed to be a keynote, but we have more of a classroom vibe going on, so I think we should make the most of it. All right, so we're going to make this a little bit interactive. Go ahead and ask me questions whenever you want. You should know that I'm going to be asking you guys questions too. So there will be some naming and shaming going on. I don't know your names, so we'll just stick with the shaming. So my name is Sree Ramaswamy. As Darren said, I just wrapped up a stint in government in the Commerce Department. I spent the last 2 weeks mostly sitting in the freezer and just cooling off. But I have been with the Noble Reach Foundation now for almost a year, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But I thought what I would do is start with my journey, including through business school, through McKinsey, through government, because I think you guys will find that relevant for the work that you're doing, for where you guys are in your careers. And also, I did go through all of the case study decks. And so I think there's stuff there that I think I want to be able to call out for you guys. And just know that the questions you were grappling with were the questions that we were grappling with in the government. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we thought of those questions and some of the challenges that we had. And I'd love to get that response, that reaction from you guys of how we should have done things or what else we could have thought about or how you would do it, okay? So we'll start with my journey because it gives you the context and also gives me a chance to talk about myself, so that's always fun. So I was born and raised in India, in Bombay, now called, anybody been to Bombay? Very good, okay. You guys liked it?
I stayed there. I just stayed there.
Brilliant. For those of you who haven't, well worth a trip. Imagine a city that has the energy of New York with the vibe of Miami with some great Indian food, right? That's Bombay. So I grew up there. Like all good South Indian boys, I became an engineer. Not because I wanted to, but because that was the only option available. So I did my engineering, and then I came to America. I came to America 30 years ago, and I came to Pittsburgh. And people asked me, sorry, any Steelers fans here? It's hard. Bloody hell, every season. But no, still, go Steelers. But I came to Pittsburgh, and people ask, why did you go to Pittsburgh? And the simple answer is, well, I applied to 10 schools, and I got rejected by 9 of them. And Pitt gave me a scholarship, so I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to Pittsburgh. And so I got a master's degree there, and I moved to DC, and I spent about a decade working in aerospace. So I worked on the space station, I worked on satellites. It sounds very cool. It was not that cool. It was actually going on. And after about a decade or so as an engineer in aerospace, I decided to go to business school. All right, so I went and got my MBA, and I went to Columbia up in New York. People ask me why I went to Columbia. It's a finance school. Why would you go there? It's like, well, I applied to 6 schools, and I got rejected by 5, and Columbia gave me a scholarship. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to Columbia. So I went to Columbia. And when I was at Columbia, in my first semester in the business school, I took a class in macroeconomics, and I absolutely loved it. Loved it so much that I actually started taking classes while in the business school. I took classes in the economics department. And so I ended up graduating with an MBA with a minor in economics. And we're going to come back to some of the stuff that you guys are learning in business school and why that is so relevant for where we are right now as a country. And so after business school, because of the interest in economics, I was trying to figure out, okay, where do I go, right? Do I go to a corporate role? Do I go back to aerospace? Do I go to consulting? Do I go to the economic think tanks? And I ended up going to McKinsey. And people ask, why did you go to McKinsey? It's like, well, I applied to about 12 places. I am not kidding you, people. I got rejected by 11. And McKinsey said, why don't you come over here? So I said, okay, I guess I'm going to McKinsey. So I went to McKinsey. And I spent 13 years at McKinsey. So I was there from 2008 until 2021. I was a partner in the DC office. I spent the first 4 years at McKinsey working on, the usual client work that you would expect from a McKinsey consultant, working mostly with big manufacturing companies, big tech companies, and with state and local governments, including the DC government. So for folks here who are enjoying the DC economy, you are welcome. This was mostly my doing. And then about 4 or 5 years into my McKinsey stint, I got involved in this thing called the McKinsey Global Institute, which is the economic think tank within McKinsey. So it was a way for me to do the economic stuff while I was still at McKinsey. And when I was at MGI, at the Global Institute, I was leading all of McKinsey's research on American competitiveness. And so we were looking at why it was that the American industrial base, the American supply chains were hollowing out, why it was difficult for new technologies, particularly kind of deep tech, hard tech sort of stuff, why it was difficult for those technologies, even though we were researching them here in this country, why it was difficult for those technologies to scale and come to fruition in this country. And unlike academic economists, who do look at all of these things, but they look at it from sort of the outside in, right? They look at the economic data, the trade data, the investment data, the productivity data. They look at all of that from the outside in and start making these conclusions about what is happening in the economy. At McKinsey, we were looking inside out because we had access to all these companies, right? And so we could go to this, I would go to a manufacturer and ask, look, you guys used to buy this widget from Wisconsin, and now you've decided to shut that supplier down, and now you're buying the same widget from Vietnam. What happened? Why? And you start to realize that the simple answers, labor cost, right? Labor is cheaper in Vietnam, that's why I'm doing it, are misleading. That's actually not the reason why this was going on. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But we were doing all of that work on supply chains, on manufacturing, on AI, on technologies. And as I was doing that, I was starting to realize that there was a fundamental misunderstanding in policy, among the policy-making crowd, about why this was happening. Okay, so let me give you an example. Most people would say that American manufacturing, American supply chains are hollowing out because our workers are too expensive. Have you guys heard this argument? Okay. If your problem is that your workers are too expensive, where does that lead you as a solution? It gets you a solution where your workers become cheaper, right? 40% of workers in America's manufacturing sector today, full-time work, they have to rely on food stamps to feed their families. You guys think that's sustainable? Right? If you start with the problem defined wrongly, you end up with a solution that is wrong, and you create a lot of human suffering along the way, right? And so I was seeing this at McKinsey. And people weren't realizing that the reason the American manufacturing base and the supply chains are hollowing out is not because labor is too expensive, it's because the capital is too expensive, right? And so we started to look at this intersection between the capital markets and the corporate sector and how that plays out in the decisions that companies make about where to invest, what to buy, who to buy from, who to employ, right? And we also took that same lens and applied it to Chinese firms, right? I will tell you, as MBA students, you guys have a unique lens into US-China competition because you can look at US-China corporate competition, right? And when you do that, you will understand how Chinese firms compete. You will understand what it means for a Chinese company to come into a market with a 40% price discount, right? To operate in a market where the cost of capital is 10% and the corporation is operating at 4% returns, right? It is essentially destroying value. Do you guys, if you go back to Adam Smith, kind of the first principles, why does a corporation exist? Anybody? Why do we have corporations? Yes? To make a profit? Fair, yes. Anybody else? Yes. To increase shareholder profits? Okay. Anybody else? So the economic theory suggests that corporations exist because they are the invisible hand of capitalism, right? A corporation takes in resources and creates value out of those resources, and that value is greater than the value of the resources. That's what a corporation is supposed to be doing. Some of that additional value that I create goes to workers. In the American system, a lot of that goes to shareholders, right? But in other countries, less so. If you now take a corporation that brings in $100 of resources and produces $60 of output of value, what is that corporation doing? Is it creating value? It is destroying value. On average, Chinese corporations destroy economic value, right? It takes an MBA to understand the implications of that, right? And so we were advising various governments, the Obama administration, the Trump White House, the Biden transition team, on these sorts of things, right? And what you find in the policymaking circles is you have a lot of really intelligent people. You have very, very, very few MBAs in policymaking circles, right? And so most folks in the policymaking world would sort of look at me and kind of say, who is this guy? What is he talking about, right? I had to brief 45 Democratic senators over a Democratic lunch a few years ago. And Elizabeth Warren was there, and Senator Booker was there, Senator Schumer was there, and I started talking about manufacturing workers on food stamps, and I said, if you want to understand why the workers are on food stamps, you need to understand that they work in companies that are competing against Chinese firms who are destroying value. And the way these American firms can survive is by squeezing their costs, their supply chains, their workers, to maintain their profitability in a scorched earth environment, right? And I got yelled at by Senator Warren, who said, who is this guy sitting out here talking about capital and investors? Why don't we have someone talking about workers? So I guess the message, something got lost in translation. Anyway, so in 2020, in late 2020, the Biden team reached out and said, you've been advising people from the outside, you're taking all these pot shots, why don't you come in and do something useful? And they said, come to Commerce. We're going to make Commerce the hub of industrial policy. Gina Raimondo is coming. And you can be there and provide your advice, and let's see if we can make something happen, right? And so for the 4 years, from 2021 through 2 weeks ago, that was my role. And so I was the senior advisor to the secretary, her chief advisor on technology policy and industrial policy. And so I was, for the first couple of years, I worked with her, the White House and Congress on shaping the CHIPS and Science Act, shaping the Inflation Reduction Act, shaping something called the Supply Chain Resiliency Program, which never made it to light of day. It passed the House in something called the America Competes Act, and then the Senate looked at it and said, we're not going to do this. But it's still there, right? So there's something there. It's called the Supply Chain Resiliency Act. So I spent the first 2 years doing that, and then I spent the next 2 years at the Secretary's request, essentially sitting on various investment committees, making sure that the CHIPS money, the CHIPS Act that we had created was executed well. So hiring people, sitting on those committees, making decisions about who gets how much money. And as I was doing all of that, I started to realize there is such a huge gap between the people who understand how corporations, businesses, capital markets, how that whole system works, and the people who are making policy and driving legislation and figuring out how to fix this problem. There is such a huge gap that I thought what we really need is an institution that can bridge this gap. And so that's why I'm at Noble Reach. right? So Noble Reach's job is to integrate talent and innovation for the service of the country. And so one of the things we're trying to do is this sort of stuff. Get you guys to understand how valuable it is what you are learning, right? How valuable it is for this country, for the industrial base, for workers, for investors. Yes, for investors too, right? Because if the investors do not see a return, all of us suffer, right? Investors are not fat cats. Some of them are fat cats, yes. But a lot of investors are people in this room. People with 401ks, right? With retirement accounts. I do not want to give my money to you as a company if you're going to take my money and destroy value with it, because it means I'm not going to get a return, right? And so that's what's going on in this economy. Let me pause there. So that's kind of my journey. Any kind of questions, reactions to some of the choices that I didn't have to make because they were made for me? Yes. It was the best job I ever had.
Oh, sorry. I'll repeat my question. What did you find most meaningful or fulfilling while you were working within the government?
Yeah, it was by far the best job I've had. Yes, I did work on the space station and this and that and the other, but my job in the government is by far the most impactful, most enjoyable job I have ever had. And I think some of it is because I felt like I was adding a lot of value, right? Which you guys will feel too. If you go into those sorts of roles with your background, you will feel like you are having an impact right away. And some of it was just the moment, right? I was fortunate. I happened to show up to work for a boss, Secretary Ramondo, to work at a moment when people were trying to figure out how to solve this problem and were genuinely open to new ideas, right? And so that's why you see in the CHIPS Act the investment tax credit, right? When this country used to be a manufacturing powerhouse back in the 50s and 60s, we used to have investment tax credits, right? It was taken away during the 1980s as tax reform, right? And so little things like that, I think, is what I really enjoyed about that job. Yes?
So you've managed to identify the problem that we're facing. And so what's your view in terms of tariffs? Because right now, when you look at the Wall Street, people are worried that that will raise the inflation if the administration imposes tariffs. So what's your view on that?
Okay, so 20 minutes in, I was kind of figuring out how long it would be before somebody asked a question about tariffs. So let me give you this story, okay? With chips, when this country does industrial policy, so like with chips, for instance, chips is an incentive program for semiconductor companies to make factories, to build factories here in the US for semiconductor production. The incentive program is what we would call market-linked incentives, right? So what does a market-linked incentive mean? It means if you as a company want to build a factory here, your investors are going to require a market return. So me as the Commerce Department is going to tell you, submit your financial models. I want to see your investment models, right? Because you're going to come to me and say, I want to build a $20 billion factory. I need $4 billion of chips money, right? And I'm going to say, give me the financial model to verify this. Underlying the financial model, as you guys should know, are projections of revenue. Underlying the revenue projections is a projection of price. So you are forecasting your price for the next 10 years for the stuff that you're producing from that factory. And based on that price and based on those revenue assumptions, you are you are trying to figure out how much return you can generate and how much chips money you need to close that gap in order to be able to maintain the return. If I now give you the money, $4 billion, and you had a price assumption and a revenue assumption, and now suddenly you're faced with Chinese competition that comes in at a 40% discounted price. What happens to your price assumption? Gone? What happens to your financial model? Out the window? More importantly for me, what happens to my incentive? I gave you 4 billion, damn it. What do? So now I'm stuck. I either let you keep the 4 billion and risk a white elephant because the project won't be completed, or I take away the 4 billion and basically destroy any chances of you building the fab. Those are my options, right? Rock and a hard place. And so one of the things that we were pushing for is, if we're going to create these incentives, you need to protect the market from non-market actors. I'll get to you, right? We did not succeed in doing so because I could not convince enough people in Congress and in the White House that we need tariffs. What happens if you don't do the incentives and you just do the tariffs, right? In 2017, in the first Trump administration, they imposed 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, right? The idea being, you put a tariff on the imports, domestic production will increase. It did not. If you just apply tariffs, the incumbents in the domestic market see their prices rising, right? If you are a corporation in the domestic market, your competitors they cannot enter your market and your prices are rising, what do? You say hallelujah, great, right? And you milk those profits because competitive dynamics have been taken away, right? That's what happened with the steel and aluminum tariffs. 2 years down the road from the tariffs, downstream producers were paying more for steel. So car companies, appliance companies, all of those manufacturers were paying more because of those tariffs. So what do? If you have incentives without tariffs, you risk the white elephant thing that I talked about. If you put tariffs without incentives, you risk downstream price increases, right? So we were pushing for, you got to do both. You got to have the tariffs in place to protect the market, but you got to have the incentives in place to promote competition. So this idea that we do one or the other, which somehow these policymakers have gotten onto this thing and it's become politicized. Like, come on, guys, you have to do both. Does that help? Yes.
I'll stand. Scott Purnell Saunders, when you proposed the kind of construct of the CHIPS Act, how much adversity did you face? Because a lot of the chips were originally manufactured here in Silicon Valley. As costs changed and wafer fabs got really big, everything went overseas. I mean, Intel had a huge foundry in Arizona, and they also have it in, Ireland and in, Taiwan, and then Fairchild Semiconductor came in. How did you propose trying to bring manufacturing that really didn't exist outside of such a niche market in certain parts of the country to, the masses that, you were trying to propose to get those operations done in a different and unique way?
So I would love to take the credit for all of it. And I will. But I talked about being in the right place at the right time, right? Meeting the moment. A lot of other people had done the groundwork for this, right? So Senator Mark Warner's office, Senator John Cornyn's office, right? There were many people on the Hill. The CHIPS Act, in a sense, predates the Biden administration. It predates the Trump administration, and it has its roots in something called the PCAST report, which is the President's Council of, I forget what the A stands for, Science and Technology Advisors. Those guys, and then folks in the Pentagon, who had started flagging as early as, I think, kind of the 2013, 2014 time period, that this is a problem. And the problem that so different people express the problem in different ways, right? But a lot of the focus was on the military supply chains, our defense supply chains, where a significant portion of chips comes either from China or from Taiwan, right? And people kind of said, okay, this is not great, right? And so that's where things started. As with a lot of things in this country, things usually start from a national security background. That's what brings people together and creates an urgency. And so that's where things started, where when I entered the scene, Where CHIPS was basically, should we just take 50 billion and dump it on a couple of companies, right? And I think what we did, which we will take credit for, is to say, hold on. We have this MBA background, we have this corporate training, we understand how these companies think, right? When we first started, and you can see that this is public information, you'll see this in the news articles, there were companies that said we're going to build one fab for 20 billion, and we're going to need 6 billion of incentives to do so. By the time we finished, we gave those companies 6 billion, but instead of building one fab for 20 billion, they were building 3 or 4 fabs for 75, 85 billion, right? That was the difference. Because we understood how these companies behave. We understood what it means to ask for a financial model and to haggle with them on the investment returns and to haggle with them on their cost of capital. Yes, somebody else had a question. Everybody else? Yes. This is my crowd here.
I'll be nice. As you look back on your career and everything you've done, is there anything that you would do differently?
I mean, I tried to do a lot of things differently. I never got any options. It was always just one. There was always just the one door that opened. Thank God, I suppose. I'm not sure. Right? I mean, it makes for a great story looking back, right? In those moments, I had no freaking idea what the hell I was. I still don't know what I'm doing, right? But you know, you kind of, I don't know, you kind of trust in the universe, I suppose, right? You find a way forward, and whatever opportunity you get, you put your shoulder down and you push as hard as you can to do whatever it is you're supposed to do. And next thing you know, you find that you're learning all these things. And that's the thing I would ask you guys to do is, you're always learning, right? But you need to take a step back every once in a while and say, what exactly am I learning here, right? And how is this useful? Keep an eye on the external environment. Where can I add value, right? This is why when I started doing all the work at McKinsey on the industrial base, you know, you need to keep an eye out on the outside to say, God, there are some terrible policy ideas that are baking there. Horrible ideas, right? The kinds of ideas that leave families on food stamps. And you pretend that you're actually increasing American competitiveness. You're not. You're actually making it worse, right? And so you see these opportunities to actually start adding some value, to start shaping certain things because of what you've learned. So that's, you know, I guess that's the thing I would say is, I probably could have gotten onto these things earlier than I did. But then I've always been late bloomer, so, you know.
So my question is, as like, you know, a minority or someone who's like historically underrepresented in the workforce, how did you, I'd say like build confidence? How did you go into these rooms and advocate for what you knew was right, even though, you know, sometimes it might not feel like, you know, people agree with you? Is that something you built over time, or is there something you did?
You know, it's interesting. I use numbers. Sounds weird. There's a movie that says mathematics is the only universal language, right? It's one of those. When I joined the government, one of the things that you see in government is people love to write memos. I'm not sure anybody actually reads the memos, but people love writing. There's memos circulating all over the place, right? So for the first month or so that I joined, like I said, there were people already working on chips. There was already some momentum cooking, right? There was memos flying around, this is what we should do. And to the secretary's credit, the first question she asked me was, if we did this, right, and we took 50 billion and we invested it, and we looked back on this in 20 years, how would we know we have succeeded? What do you need to do in order to make sure we succeeded, right? And so that starts this whole train of thought to say, okay, there was a lot of manufacturing going on here, right? 40% of production of semiconductors was in this country as late as 1990. It's now down to 8%, 9%. In 20 years, if you had to turn it back up, let's say back up to 15%, what does that mean in terms of total production capacity? There are forecasts from the industry of what global production is going to look like, right, in 10, 20 years. So you can start to make these numbers, say, okay, I need this much production. that's going to cost this many dollars. That production I need to split between this much of leading edge, that much of analog chips, this much of the legacy chips that go into defense equipment, this much in the supply chain, right? And we started putting numbers down. And the moment you put numbers down, everybody else feels like, oh crap, this guy knows what he's talking about, even though I had no idea what I was talking about, right? But it's an estimate. It's a line in the sand to say, here are numbers of how this thing could unfold. And immediately, commerce was put in the driver's seat, right? And that's really what did it. So I'm sure there are other ways of doing this, right? And I'm sure that folks who are underrepresented have way more challenges than I faced. But this is one way that I kind of dealt with it, right? Because there were, underrepresentation in one form, yes, but, I had other challenges. This was my first time in government. Many of the people who had been there have been in government for many years, right? People in the Obama White House who are now in the Biden White House, people in Congress, they all knew each other. And here I come with this McKinsey thing, and people looking at me like, who the hell are you, right? Where did you come from? So that has its own challenges. But when you start, in my case, when you start putting the numbers down and you put a rationale behind it, people start to see, okay, this is one way forward. Okay? Yes? I'm glad to see the questions, by the way. There are a couple of other things I do want to get to, but I want to make sure you get these questions, of course.
You spoke about Chinese corporations undercutting value, right? So my question is, if they are undercutting value in the market, how do they make money? Then if they don't make money, what is their goal?
Yeah, so good question. Do you guys remember your corporate finance well? No, what the hell, man? So the economic value of a corporation, the way you measure it is by looking at the total amount of capital that the corporation has multiplied by its excess ROIC, right? So excess ROIC, so ROIC minus WACC. So I raise a bunch of capital which has a certain cost. I create value which is more valuable than that. I take that delta and I multiply it by the amount of capital I have, and that's the total amount of economic value that I've created, right? So it all comes down to how do I get access to really cheap capital so that the cost is very low, and how do I maximize my pricing and my profits so that my ROIC is very high, and so the bigger the difference, the more economic value I'm creating, right? That ROIC has two components to it. One is the margin, which is for every dollar that I make by selling something, how much profit am I making, is one piece of it. The second piece is what's called capital turns, which is for every dollar of capital that I have, how much revenue am I generating, right? So if you keep the equation of the math equation, I wish I had a board here, but if you keep the math equation in your head, right? Revenue divided by invested capital multiplied by profit divided by revenue gives you profit divided by invested capital, which is your return on invested capital, right? Chinese firms destroy margin. They destroy profits by undercutting prices, and so their margins, if you look at Chinese firms on average, is terrible. They compensate for that by extracting as much revenue as they can from their capital base. When you understand that the way a Chinese firm competes is by deploying capital and maximizing the revenue from that capital, you now look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative in a very different light, right? BRI, which is a Chinese geostrategic project, they need it to sustain their corporations. Because if you did not have BRI, you would not be able to go into new markets and create new capital and find new sources of revenue. You would not be able to do it. You would have to rely on margin improvements, and they cannot do that because they've undercut prices and destroyed profits, right? And so the question for us becomes, if we are trying to sustain ourselves, how do you do this? Because our companies need to do the same thing, right? You cannot raise prices in a scorched market, and so your margin pressures are really strong. You cannot fight the Chinese companies to try to grow revenue because they're undercutting you on pricing. So if you're an American company, what do? To maximize economic value, ROIC minus WACC times IC, right, invested capital, what you do is you pull back on your invested capital, right? Because when you deploy the capital, you know you are going to destroy value. And so the way you try to preserve value is by reducing the amount of capital that you invest, which is why American companies are pulling out of manufacturing and asset-intensive operations, which is why the industrial base is hollowing out. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kemi Akindide. Thank you for your talk. I just have a question about something you said earlier about learning from your experiences. I was wondering, what's something that or how has working in government affected how you think strategically in any aspect of your life?
So the folks at Noble Reach know that one of the things I'd like to do is move to Iceland and become a sheep farmer, right? I think of that as a strategic choice because I kind of see where the world is headed, and I was like, if I can push a button and get off right now, I would. I think there are a couple of things it has done. One is it has really, for me, shone a light on the talent situation. How can you have, as a you can call America great, you can call it, make it exceptional, whatever it is, right? The reality is you are in an economic competition. You are in a geopolitical competition of the sort we have not seen in this country for decades. You cannot fight this competition if you don't have the talent to be able to do it. Right now we don't, right? The reason I was able to have an impact in government is not because I'm some kind of a superhuman, right? It's because the bar is so low that I could have an impact, right? Which is the story of my life, by the way. Which would be my one piece of career advice for you guys. Find places where the bar is low. Seriously, right? There were so few people who understood. Like, I had to do 101 sessions on what ROIC is, right? To a government that is now trying to figure out, how do I take taxpayer money and stimulate investments by corporations, right? Let me give you another example. So your first question in your case study was, I'm going to see if I can read it out, right? How should companies manage national security considerations? Something like that? How should they adapt supply chains to safeguard national security while remaining competitive in a global market? Let me ask you a question. 90% of our most advanced semiconductors come from Taiwan, right? Who do you think lost more sleep about that? Folks in the White House National Security Council or folks on the board of Apple and NVIDIA? This is a government initiative to do something about this. Why should that be? There's no reason for that to be, right? You would think that a company that is sole sourced, a $1 trillion market cap company, whose valuation is entirely dependent on that one source of supply, would be banging on the doors of the federal government saying, you've got to do something, right? Instead, what happened, right? We had to advocate for chips. We got the money. We started providing incentives to chip manufacturers, and as recently as just a couple of months ago, September, October 2024, you can Google it. There's a news article. Commerce Secretary pushing for companies like NVIDIA and Apple to buy domestic chips. Why does the Commerce Secretary have to push them to do so? Right? When on taxpayer-funded dollars, we are giving them a dual source. Right? So to your question, like from a strategic standpoint, like this is what the government experience makes you realize. You're like, geez, we are just not set up for this. Right? So that's part of, I think, what we're trying to do, like even at Noble Reach, right, wherever else I go, can we just get more people to understand this? And it's folks like you guys, right? It is not technologists, it is not policymakers, it's definitely not campaign finance people. It's people like you guys who understand the corporate sector, right? More than any other country in the world, this country is a capitalist country, which means the pricing and allocation of capital drives the economy, number one. And number two, it is a corporate nation. The vast majority of activities that are done in this country, whether they are non-profit or for-profit, in healthcare, education, they are done through the corporate form. Unlike, let's say, in France, right, where the government, through its own form, does a bunch of activities, here there's a corporate form. So you have a government who does not understand corporate form and does not understand capital allocation, is now trying to fight with a supposedly communist country that actually seems to understand this a lot more than we do. Right? So that's kind of the strategic, like how do you deal with that is kind of what I'm grappling with on a personal basis. Okay? I should have warned you guys this was not going to be an inspiring talk. But I hope you guys understand the value of what you guys can bring to this. Right? Like this kind of geopolitical competition. So wherever you go, whether you go to consulting firms, banks, corporations, government, keep this in mind. Okay? There's ways that you can add value that you may not even realize. That's what I realized when I went to government. Okay? I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the questions somebody asked recently was, what are the things that you wanted to get done and you couldn't get done, right? So what are some ways that we can tie this corporate capital markets thing with the security and sustainability, for instance, right? A lot of the questions that you guys dealt with were around security, sustainability, right? Externalities, right? Basically, those are all things that a corporation does not solve for. Is that fair? Right? And so a lot of the work that you guys were doing in your presentations, in your decks, is all about how do you navigate that externality, right? How do you use AI to figure it out? Some of you talked about, better monitoring and real-time responses. Some of you guys talked about things like predictive maintenance, that sort of stuff, right? Like being able to predict what's going on, whether that's demand forecasting or whatever else. And the one thing I want you guys to think about a little bit is a collective action problem, okay, which I did not see in the decks. I don't blame you for it. It's something I only realized after many years of what a collective action problem is, right? So let me ask you guys this question. We talk about risk and security and sustainability and resiliency comes up all the time, right? Supply chain resiliency is a big deal, right? Everybody kind of talks about supply chain resiliency. And people kind of frame this as resiliency versus efficiency, right? So let me ask you guys this, with your MBA hat on, your corporate finance, your accounting, think about you guys all did financial statements? Yeah? Balance sheet, income statement, cash flow? All right. What are some ways that you can measure how efficient a company is? You guys toss it out? Operating cash flow, okay, which measures what type of efficiency? The cash generated from the operations of a company. Yes, that's one measure of efficiency. Any others? Yes? Return on assets, which is a way of measuring if the company has got assets, physical assets, how profitable are they, right? So it's kind of an asset productivity. Okay? Any others? Yes? Average days in inventory, which measures what? Is higher better or lower better? Let's say I'm an investor and I have $1 of money, I'm trying to figure out who to give to. Lower is better? Days in inventory, yeah, okay. Any others? Just throw them out, there's more. Yes? To measure the waste? Good, okay. So sort of a measure of, finished goods versus work in progress, right? Kind of gives you how much of the inventory you're actually translating. Good, okay. Sort of an efficiency of your production process, basically. Okay? There are others, right? Your gross margin is one, right? Which is measures if how efficient your supply chain is, right? Yes, go ahead. Working capital, yeah, which tells you how well you're managing your suppliers, your accounts receivable, your accounts payable, right? How well you're managing all of that, right? Working capital. Any others? One or two more? There's lots more. Net present value. Is that an efficiency metric? That is an efficiency metric. You're right. It can be, but it's a forward-looking efficiency metric, right? Net present value is kind of a forward-looking view. What about a current view? Keep in mind, I'm an investor, and I'm trying to figure out which of your companies I should invest in. Right? I could look at operating margin. I could look at capital turns. I could look at various inventory measures. Right? Good. Okay. Now imagine I'm an investor, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, I want to invest in a company that is resilient. What can you tell me about how resilient your companies are? What metric would I look at? It's a quality. It's in your MD&A, right? Management discussion analysis section. Yes. Any others? Any metrics? Anything I can look at? Because keep in mind, what I'm trying to do as an investor, I have all of your companies to invest in, and I'm going to choose, right? And as an investor, I'm going to prioritize based on quantitative analysis, right? You are demonstrably more efficient. You are demonstrably more efficient at assets, more inventory. Yes? Historical stock price. So longevity. You look at longevity as a measure of resilience. Okay. Any others? So I would suggest that the longer a company has been in operation, the more likely it is that it's a good candidate for my investment, for my dollar. So I would rather give the money to a company like Texas Instruments than to a company like TSMC. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So what I wanted to highlight is a collective action problem, right? There are very few metrics, if any at all, that can help you measure resiliency. To the extent that a company tries to improve its resiliency by increasing its inventory, by dual sourcing its factories, an investor like me is going to look at that company compared to its peers and say, this guy is a lot more inefficient, doesn't know how to use capital, I am not going to invest in this thing, right? You talked about the qualitative analysis of NVIDIA and the Taiwan thing, right? This is what we were dealing with, right? Because we asked them, why are you continuing to source? And what you realize is that when a company is making supply chain decisions or financial decisions and has its investment models, it does risk pricing. And these companies don't know how to price the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. How do you price the risk? It's like asking how you price the risk of an asteroid hit, right? How do you do that? Don't know. Don't know the probability, don't know the magnitude. What if the Chinese invade Taiwan? What happens to the semiconductor supply chain? Do we know? Does it get disrupted? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the Chinese will just say, we'll continue selling. They're just not called Taiwanese chips anymore, they're called Chinese chips. Maybe there's no disruption, right? And so this is what we started to see. So when you ask a question like this, how can a company manage national security while being able to be globally competitive, you realize that a company is not able to manage national security because it does not know how to think about risk pricing, right? That is a collective action problem. We used to have this problem in the climate situation until Mark Carney in the Bank of England and Mike Bloomberg got together and said, you know what, if I'm an investor and I'm going to give you money and you have a warehouse in Miami that could get flooded in the next 30 years, I need to know that before I give you the money, right? If you have a factory in the Gulf Coast that could get destroyed because the hurricanes are getting stronger, I need to know that. You need to tell me that, right? And so they started this whole process with the Bank of England, the Committee on Financial Disclosures, Bloomberg got involved, and now there is a reporting mechanism that companies have to adhere to disclose their climate asset risk, right? That is one of the things we have not done in this country, right? So as you guys think about your slides and how you use AI to focus on supply chain resiliency or supply chain efficiencies, spend a little bit of thought and think about these collective action problems. Where can you as a company do this by yourself? And where do you need other people involved? Right? And what you'll find is over and over again, these kinds of issues, societal issues, right? Sustainability, security, labor issues, these are typically issues where an individual company has a collective action problem. Okay? Any reactions? This is less of a keynote and more of a lecture, I can see. A lecture without even a whiteboard or slides, you know. Can I just say, as a former McKinsey person without slides, like, this is a big deal. This is... Okay. I am going to wrap up with one other thing that you guys should think about as you think about the concept, the topic of AI in your supply chains. I didn't see as much mention of this, okay? And that's why I'm bringing it up. Companies that do well at AI are companies that did well with digital. If you're a company that has not done digital investments over the last 20 years, AI is going to leave you behind, right? Because AI, as you know, relies on data ecosystems. One of the big challenges of AI in the supply chain is that the data is fragmented across companies, right? And if I am a supplier to you as a customer, and you're asking me for all of my data, the more data I give you as my customer, the less of a bargaining position I have with you in the future, right? If you know everything about how I run my business, what factories I have, what inventory levels I have, if you know everything about me, then you can dictate things to me. And I don't want that, right? And so this kind of a dilemma has popped up over and over again, and we saw this all the time at McKinsey, right? And so because you can't do this, because you can't share this data because suppliers don't want to share the data, you end up in a situation where the digital thread through the supply chain is fragmented. And because the digital thread is fragmented, your ability to apply AI across the supply chain is limited, right? We saw this during the chip shortage when I was at the Commerce Department, when all these companies would come yelling and shouting, saying, I can't find chips, right? You'd have medical device companies saying, I can't find chips for my medical equipment. You'd have car companies saying, my factories are shutting down because I can't find chips. And we would ask them, okay, who's not giving you the chips? What types of chips are you not able to find? Oh, we will get back to you on that. We're not sure, right? In late 2023, we conducted a mandatory survey of companies, mandatory survey of defense companies, critical infrastructure companies, and hyperscalers. And we said, we need you to tell us, what Chinese chips do you have in your supply chain? What types of chips? Who are the suppliers? What is the price? Mandatory survey, more than half these companies came back and said, we don't know. Right? So when you talk about AI in the supply chain, this is what you're dealing with. There is just no visibility. Okay? So part of what you guys need to figure out as you think about AI in your supply chains or AI in your operations is, where is the data? Where is the damn data? And how do you make sure you get that, right? And so I just wanted to make sure you guys keep that in mind as you're thinking about your kind of the work that you guys did as part of this case competition. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up, unless there's any last questions, but I will be around for a while. Thank you. I'm going to ask Linda to come forward and